Good morning, church family. I'm really grateful to be talking to you all this morning. If you don't know me, my name is Jordan, and I am the Director of Youth and College Ministries here at City Church. So if you are a youth or if you're in college, come say hi to me. I'd love to meet you and love to say hi. If this is your first week with us, or maybe it's your first week in a while, we are currently in a series going through the book of Philippians called Defiant Joy in Distressing Times. And we're studying every single chapter of the book of Philippians together as a church. And today we're specifically going to be looking at Philippians chapter 2, verses 19 through 30, what Steve just read. So if you have Bibles or phones, you can go ahead and turn there with me as we get started. Specifically this morning, we're going to talk about the idea of encouragement as joy. But before we get there, I want to take a second to share something interesting that I learned recently. So over fall break, my wife and I, we took our son to Washington, D.C. We were going to go to the beach, but there was a hurricane, so we didn't go to the beach. We pivoted, went to Washington, D.C., and we did that as a family vacation. And while we were there, it really was surreal to visit some of the most iconic and influential places in our country's history. And one specific location that we really enjoyed being at was the Lincoln Memorial, and we actually have a picture up there. So that's my son Shepard in front of the Lincoln Memorial. He was clearly not impressed at all by the really tall statue. He really liked his book instead. But even though he wasn't impressed, it was still a really cool experience. Not only was this place the setting for some really history-shaping moments like Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, but it also evoked a sense of reverence for this man who had a major hand in shaping our country for the better. Abraham Lincoln really was a larger-than-life leader who was praised for how well he led our country for the way that he approached the Civil War. Now, with that being said, I think it's interesting to note that the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. Actually includes a display of several articles, like newspaper clippings, that the president had on him, on his person, the night that he was assassinated. And one of those articles is this worn-out newspaper clipping which celebrated his accomplishments as president. And the article reads, "Abe Lincoln is one of the greatest statesmen of all time." Now, I think it's interesting to note that this man who galvanized a nation through incredibly difficult circumstances was still not immune to negativity and discouragement. I think the temptation for us might be to hear that he had these clippings on him and these articles on him, and you're like, okay, a bit of a narcissistic move, Abe Lincoln. But when we look at his life and we look at this act in light of his life, we actually see that he had spent many years over the course of his life battling like really tough depression and had a lot of episodes where he nearly ended his life as a result of this depression. So we take a step back and we see that despite his position, even the leader of the free world needed to hear from time to time that he was doing a good job. And the stark reality for President Lincoln and the stark reality for you and me is that if left unchallenged, discouragement can permeate and overcome any of us. I think the reality is that encouragement, it doesn't happen by accident, right? It's something that has to be intentional and purposeful and consistent. And the reason I say that is because discouragement is oftentimes much easier to come by, and it sticks with us for much longer. So for instance, if I wake up and I make some cereal for breakfast and I brew some coffee and I go to work, that's a fairly uneventful morning, right? Like it's not super memorable. However, if the cereal was stale and the milk was spoiled and I spilled the coffee on me and I was late for work, then that kind of sets the tone for the whole day, right? Like that's all I'm thinking about for the whole day. Maybe some of you can relate to having those kinds of mornings. Maybe some of you had that kind of morning this morning. If you did, I'm sorry. But it's the kind of morning where you feel like you're already in a hole and you spend your entire day trying to crawl out of it. Can you all relate to those kinds of mornings, that kind of discouragement that we can so easily face and that we can carry with us throughout the day? In fact, I think if we take a step back, we see that discouragement, it really is a human issue that we experience on a national scale. Pew Research Center found that 58% of Americans, so over half of Americans, would agree that life is worse today than it was 50 years ago. Life is worse today than it was 50 years ago. At this point, You may be thinking, wow, this is the least encouraging talk on encouragement that I've ever heard. Trust me, we're going to turn the corner here in a minute, but I want you to see that this is a real issue for people. And as followers of Jesus, we know that this is deeper than just having a bad day, right? Like the devil loves nothing more than to watch us sink into isolation and discouragement. And he's doing his best to make sure that that happens in our lives as much as possible. In fact, when we look at the author of the book of Philippians, Paul, we see that he was very acquainted with discouraging circumstances. We've already talked in this series about how Paul is actively writing this letter while being under house arrest, but I would encourage you at some point to go read about what Paul went through as he's leading up to this moment, being imprisoned in Rome. To give you a quick Cliff Notes version of it, Paul gets lost at sea during a storm. He gets shipwrecked on a random Mediterranean island, and then while collecting firewood after the shipwreck, he gets bit by a poisonous snake, right? Like clearly Paul had every right to experience discouragement as a result of his circumstances. But when we read the letter to the Philippians, that's not the attitude that we see Paul adopt. In spite of all the difficult things he was experiencing, Paul insisted on encouragement. So I'd love for us to walk through this passage together and hopefully understand how Paul was able to live out encouragement as a source of joy and how encouragement poured out onto other people as a result of Paul's attitude. So Philippians 2, verses 19 through 20, we're going to start there. And Paul says, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, that I also may be cheered when I receive news about you. I have no one else like him who will show genuine concern for your welfare. For everyone looks out for their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know that Timothy has proved himself because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. So right off the bat, we see that Timothy has been with Paul while he's under Roman imprisonment. And for those of you who may not know, Timothy was a follower of Jesus who was discipled, and he was on mission with Paul as he planted churches throughout the Roman world. Now, we can probably assume that at this time, Timothy was acting as Paul's helper while he's in prison. So Timothy was probably running errands and buying supplies, getting food, and ministering to Paul's needs during his time in Rome. I think it'd be fair to say that Timothy was indispensable to Paul while he was imprisoned. Paul even goes as far as to say that he has nobody else like him. Now, I think it's easy to read Paul's letter to the Philippians and mainly see it as a letter meant to encourage and instruct the church in Philippi. But if we remember from chapter 1, Timothy was with Paul while Paul was actually writing this letter to the Philippians. So he would see every single word going into this letter. And in fact, many New Testament scholars actually believe that Paul was starting to lose his eyesight at this point in his life. So it's a very real possibility that when Paul's talking about him and Timothy writing the letter, what Paul's doing is he's dictating while Timothy is actively writing down the words that Paul is saying about him. Things that elevated Timothy, things that honored Timothy, things that gave Timothy courage to continue in his work of the gospel. So imagine for a second that the person that you admire most, get that person in your mind. This person who spent several years investing in you is now speaking beautiful encouragements that they've noticed in your life over you for the benefit of other people. Regardless of who was physically writing this, Timothy witnessed every word that made it into the letter where Paul, his mentor in the faith, was speaking these incredible words of encouragement and commendation about Timothy. I'd be willing to bet that Timothy's eyes were filling with tears as the man whom he saw as a father figure gushed about him to their church family. Even in the midst of imprisonment, Paul looks at his son in the faith, Timothy, and he acknowledges that this is probably pretty hard for Timothy as well. Timothy was so much younger than Paul. Timothy was actually young enough to be Paul's son. He was away from his family, he was away from his friends, and he had to experience some of those same lost at sea and shipwreck scenarios that Paul did as well. Not to mention, Timothy had to see this man whom he cared for deeply chained to a Roman guard, awaiting a possible death sentence. Paul saw this reality and decided that the most helpful thing that he could do would be to actually encourage Timothy, affirming his ministry and pointing out some of the greatest things that he saw in his young friend. one thing in particular. When you look at what Paul says just a few verses ago in Philippians 2, verses 3 through 4, we've already gone over these, but he says in verse 3, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. So jump back down to verse 20, Paul saying, hey, if you want to know what it looks like to humble yourselves and value others as more important than yourselves, then look no further than Timothy. He's your example on this. He does this better than anybody else I know. So to hear the most righteous man you know affirming not only to you, but to an entire church that you have embodied gospel truth in such a way that others should look to you as an example, then I have to believe that not only was Timothy encouraged in the midst of difficult circumstances, but so was the church in Philippi, knowing that Paul was soon going to send this man whom they could look to as an example. Just like Kent mentioned last week, it can't be overstated how powerful it is when followers of Jesus can be encouraged by the faithfulness and obedience of other followers of Jesus. Paul understands this truth. It's that encouragement acts as a fuel for gospel ministry. Encouragement acts as a fuel for gospel ministry. So when you and I hear stories of how God has worked in the lives of our people, it puts wind in our sails, it inspires us, it encourages us to continue living out the gospel. That's part of the reason why we have those 2 minutes every single week to do that together, so that we can share stories about how God is working in our lives to mutually encourage each other in those moments. At the same time, when someone specifically points out how you are embodying an aspect of following Jesus, it makes you want to live that aspect out even more. So I remember sitting one time in a meeting with some other church leaders, and at the end of the meeting, I was asked to pray to close. So I prayed, as I do, and after the meeting, one of the women on staff walked up to me and she said, Jordan, I just love when you pray. It always comes across as so sincere. Now, that might seem like a simple encouragement, and to her, it probably was. But what she didn't know is that I was in a season where I felt really far from God. And it felt like my prayers were falling on deaf ears. And in that moment, not only did this woman encourage me by saying something kind, but she actually acted as the voice of God in my life, telling me that my prayers were being heard. So what happened? I prayed harder. I prayed more earnestly because I now knew that the Lord was listening to what I was bringing to him. That's the power of encouragement for followers of Jesus. And Paul decides that he doesn't just want to stop at encouraging Timothy. So let's jump to verse 25. Paul continues and he says, but I think it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. So after commending Timothy, Paul brings up another man named Epaphroditus, and we see that Epaphroditus was actually a part of the Philippian church, and once they heard that Paul had arrived in Rome and that he was in prison, the Philippians decided to send money and supplies and resources by way of sending Epaphroditus, who was also there to assist Paul in whatever he needed. Now, I think it's important to note that this wasn't like me driving from Maryville to Knoxville to like drop off a casserole at Ken and Anna's house. I'm sure they would love if I did that, or any of us did that. But this is a different scenario. Like Epaphroditus would have had to gather all of his supplies and travel for 6 to 8 weeks in order to make it from Philippi to Rome. So he travels for 2 months. He leaves behind a job. He leaves behind his family, his church. He leaves behind his whole life to go serve Paul while he's imprisoned. And we see that apparently Epaphroditus was with Paul for a while, because Paul continues in verse 26 saying, for he, Epaphroditus, longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill and almost died, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I am all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad and I may have less anxiety. So during his time with Paul, Epaphroditus has become ill at some point, and Paul says that he was actually so sick that he almost died, but God thankfully had mercy on Epaphroditus. But notice where Epaphroditus' mind was. He wasn't relieved that he was healed. I'm sure he was relieved, but that's not what Paul decided to write about. He doesn't show that Epaphroditus was relieved, but he shows that he was distressed. because Epaphroditus didn't want his church family in Philippi to be worrying about him. So even at his own expense, Paul decides to send Epaphroditus back to the Philippians because it would alleviate everyone's anxiety, including Paul's. So with that being said, I think it's important to note that just like Timothy was with Paul when this letter was being written, and he was encouraged by Paul's words, it's very likely that Epaphroditus was actually the one who carried this letter from Paul to the Philippians. And in keeping with ancient customs, he was probably the one who actually read it over the church once he got there. So he was aware of the content of the letter, commending him to the Philippian church. So how does this play out? Well, Epaphroditus was able to stand in front of his church family and read a letter from the greatest church planter of all time, talking about how Epaphroditus was a brother to him, a fellow co-worker in the gospel ministry, a fellow soldier as well. Just like Paul made sure that Timothy would be encouraged in this letter, he made sure Epaphroditus would be as well. So Paul ends this section by saying, verse 29, "So then welcome him, Epaphroditus, in the Lord with great joy, and honor people like him, because he almost died for the work of Christ. He risked his life to make up for the help that you yourselves could not give me." So Paul doesn't mince words here. He's very clear. Epaphroditus was willing to die for the work of Christ. And because of that, because of his commitment to the kingdom of God, then Epaphroditus should be honored. Now, with that being said, I think we're able to see the weight of these verses and the power of this encouragement in light of a specific word that Paul used in describing Epaphroditus. So in verse 25, we go back and we see that he says that Epaphroditus is his fellow soldier. Fellow soldier. So you and I hear that, and we may think of something like the movie Saving Private Ryan, right? Soldiers who were committed to each other no matter what they faced. But I think the reality is a lot of us probably don't have experience, like firsthand experience with what it's like to be in that kind of community, that military community. Maybe some of you have, and you 100% understand what it's like to be brothers in arms with somebody else. But I'd say the grand majority of us don't really have a context for what that really means firsthand. However, for many of the people in the Philippian church, their ears would have perked up at the mention of a soldier. Remember, the city of Philippi was heavily comprised of retired officers from the Roman military. These are guys who fought alongside other soldiers for years. They knew the depths of relationship that was formed by going to war with another soldier. Paul understood this, and he intentionally starts to paint this picture of Epaphroditus as a soldier who had left home for war. Epaphroditus should be honored just as much as the veterans returning home as war heroes, is what Paul says. In this culture that honors veterans so much, he says, look to Epaphroditus and look at what he's doing and honor him just as much. Not because he went and he conquered all this land for the Roman military, but because he risked his life and gave his life to the work of building the kingdom of God. This is a connection that not only the Philippians would immediately understand, but Epaphroditus as well. So we see that Paul specifically spoke the right encouragement in the right way over the right person in order to build up not only Epaphroditus, but also the entire Philippian church. And because of this, Epaphroditus and the Philippians were emboldened to continue sharing the truth of who Jesus is, building the kingdom of God, even in the midst of difficult circumstances. Once again, we see encouragement acts as fuel for gospel ministry. That's why Paul takes his time in this short letter to commend the lives of Timothy and Epaphroditus to the Philippian church. And he does it both as a way of invoking trust from the Philippians towards Timothy and Epaphroditus, and no doubt to encourage Timothy and Epaphroditus with what he wrote. So it's evident from this passage today that from the way that Paul speaks in general, he is deeply committed to the practice of biblical encouragement. So with that in mind, it begs the obvious question. What would it look like for City Church to be a community of believers who went out of our way to participate in this same kind of gospel-fueled encouragement? What would it look like for us to do that? I'm glad you asked. That's a really great question. I think that being a church marked by encouragement is something that we should strive for, right? So for the next few minutes, I want to look at how we can frame this idea of encouragement so that we can model it the same way here at City Church as Paul did for the Philippians 2,000 years ago. So as we start to see what it means to embody this, the first thing that we should establish is the purpose of encouragement. The purpose of encouragement. The reason I think this is important is because my guess is that there are a lot of situations where we can easily think that what we're doing is encouragement, when in reality, it's something else. So for instance, I think it's really easy to just see encouragement as a motivational speech, right? If you see someone who's having trouble getting through a season in life or is struggling with one specific problem, you may try to offer some motivational words like, you can do this, I've got your back, you're going to do great, or the most Christian one, God is in control, right? Like those are things that we might say or might hear. And while those things may be true and they might be helpful in a way, I think those kinds of statements stop short of what Paul is demonstrating for us in the book of Philippians. If we're being honest, anybody can motivate you, right? In fact, if I need motivation, a lot of times I'll just pull up like pregame speeches from quarterbacks or coaches before a football game. Those will have me ready to run through a brick wall. It'll get me so excited, right? Maybe some of the guys in here can relate to that. But those aren't personal, right? They don't speak directly into my life. And that's where we start to draw the line between encouragement and motivation. Now, don't hear me say that motivation is a bad thing, because it's not. But if we're not careful, I think our motivations can very easily turn into manipulation. It would have been very easy for Paul to write a letter to the Philippians telling them that, hey, you're doing a great job, but if you could actually send me some more resources and let me hold on to Epaphroditus for a little bit longer, I think that's totally understandable, right? But that's not what we see. Paul wasn't encouraging Timothy and Epaphroditus in the church in Philippi because it served his interests. Paul was encouraging them because it was an overflow of love and appreciation that was in his heart. So for us, we also have to be careful that we aren't subconsciously using encouragement as a tool to gain favor with people so that they're going to behave in a way that aligns with our interests. That's manipulation 101. So to kind of illustrate this, let's say that some friends invite me over to hang out one weekend, but I was also out the weekend before, so I wasn't with my wife and son. So this would mean that I'd be gone for 2 weekends in a row. Now, the temptation for me might be to walk into the living room and tell my wife, hey, babe, I just want to let you know that you're an absolute rock star of a mom, right? The way that you parent is just so beautiful. And it's truly amazing. In fact, you don't even need me, right? Like, you're such a good parent. You don't even need my help. You're so good at it. Anyways, would you mind if I went and hung with the boys this weekend, right? Like, maybe that's not the most direct way that you've seen it play out, but we still do this, right? Like, sometimes it's still a temptation to use encouragement as a way to get something that we want. So when encouragement becomes about us instead of the other person, that's when it's no longer encouragement, it's manipulation. That's why when we turn the page and we start uncovering what the purpose of encouragement actually is, we see that encouragement is and has to be inherently selfless. In fact, Paul was actively robbing himself of 2 men that he depended on simply so that he could encourage the Philippians by sending them aid in the forms of Timothy and Epaphroditus. So when encouragement remains truly selfless, when we start from a place of selflessness, that's when we start to see the power of encouragement really start to take hold. That's when we're able to start affirming the good things going on in people's lives, speaking truth about the things that we see that are reflections of how God has made them or even changed them for the better. Maybe this looks like speaking encouragement over parents in your life that you know and bringing light to the areas that you see them doing a really good job. Or maybe you see someone who's currently going through the gauntlet of exams this time of year. You know a student who's dealing with that. And it's a lot harder when Tennessee wins big games. They're not studying like they probably should have been last night, right? So you see them going through all these big things. So what you do is you buy them a coffee and you let them know that you see how hard they're working in those specific areas. And you encourage them that God's going to bless their faithfulness. This could even look like pointing out a blessing in someone else's life that they haven't even noticed yet. Maybe like how someone in your life group inspires you to persist in prayer or generosity. That's what encouragement can look like. But selfless encouragement is also able to inspire people towards growth as well. This could be as simple as calling out the progress that someone's made when it comes to physical or mental health, or celebrating someone's accomplishments at work or school, or even speaking into where you've seen someone grow in their maturity as a follower of Jesus. Those are all great encouragements that inspire people to continue working in those things. And what's really cool is that as we continue to live out this lifestyle of encouragement, we see the Lord actually retroactively maturing us as well. We make encouragement about other people, but we see God work through that in our own lives, eliminating poisonous attitudes of envy and self-righteousness, which we'll talk more about next week, and comparison that we may be holding on to. So to put it as simply as possible, how should we as City Church define the purpose of encouragement? Well, in light of this series, I think it's helpful to remember the theme of the entire letter, right? Defiant joy in distressing times. And if you remember our definition, if joy is the ability to celebrate good things wherever they exist, then encouragement is doing that for someone else. It's celebrating good things in other people wherever they exist. When we're encouraging others, we're looking into their life and we're celebrating the good things that are there with intentionality. Not in an attempt to distract people from their problems or manipulate people, but to help them frame their problems in light of the blessings that God has given them. So with all that being said, I do think it would now be helpful to see how we can practically start to implement the practice of encouragement into our daily rhythms. What would it look like for this to become a more potent part of our life? So something that you may have noticed during this conversation is that encouragement isn't really a discipline that we practice in isolation. Sure, there may be times when we need to speak truth over ourselves, but when we look at Paul, the source of his encouragement was always tied to the relationships that he had with other followers of Jesus. We see this clearly in Romans chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, when Paul writes to the church in Rome saying, verse 11, "I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith." The gift that Paul wants to give to the Romans is mutual encouragement. He wants to tell them about the things that he's experienced. He wants to hear about the ways the church has grown in Rome. And he wants that to happen through the context of relationships. So if we take a step back, we see that encouragement is a feature of Jesus-centered community. So if we want to take part in the depth of encouragement that we see Paul model for us, it's fair to say that we should also be active in Jesus-centered community the same way that Paul was. See, once we're in a relationship with others, then we're able to specifically speak into their lives in helpful and meaningful ways. Paul was able to encourage Timothy and Epaphroditus because he knew them. He spent time with them. He experienced life with them. He had relationships with them. If a stranger walks up to you and they say that they're proud of you, that probably comes across as a little weird, right? Like, that's a little odd if a guy off the street walks up and says, "Hey, I'm proud of you." I'm stepping away from that guy. But if it's your dad or like father figure in your life and they say that they're proud of you, it might cause you to break down in tears. I speak from personal experience on that. If a random old lady in Walmart sees you with your kids and tells you that you're a good parent, well, that's sweet, but she didn't really watch you get the kids out the door that morning. She might not think the same thing if she saw that. But if your spouse, who was also there with you when you were trying to get the kids out the door that morning, points out where you specifically did a good job parenting, then it puts wind in your sails and encourages you to continue growing in that area. It makes you excited about doing those things. So this means that the most practical thing that you can do to start implementing encouragement into your daily life is to ensure that you're sharing life with other followers of Jesus. The reality is that if you only see other followers of Jesus for an hour here on Sundays and maybe a couple hours at Life Group, chances are you're not going to have a lot of source material for encouraging those people. But if you're regularly integrating yourself into other people's lives, seeing them on a regular basis in their everyday settings, chances are you've got a lot more to go on when it comes to how you can actually encourage the people that are close to you in your life. So then, once you're in a place where you're deeply engaged in Jesus-centered relationships, once you found yourself with those people, I would encourage you to then start focus on being a listener before a talker. Focus on being a listener before a talker. It's going to be really difficult to speak into the specifics of someone's life, if you haven't taken the time to intentionally listen to the things that are actually happening in their life. Paul notes that so much of his own encouragement came from just hearing about what was happening in the lives of the Philippians. And because he took the time to hear about their lives, he was able to speak direct and specific encouragement over the Philippian church. So when you go into a conversation with someone, let me encourage you, make it a point to listen to what's going on. Ask good questions. Make that person feel heard and understood. Take notes of things that you've talked about. Maybe actually physically take notes, write things down so that you can keep track of the people who are close to you, and you can then go back and speak encouragement and follow up. This requires intentionality. So when you're in life group and someone shares about something difficult going on, don't just jump straight to your own experience with the same thing, but take time to make sure that that person knows that they were listened to. Once you've done that, once you've taken the time to listen and familiarize yourself with another person, you're able to start seeing the good things that God has placed in their life that are worth celebrating. And whenever you see those things, you're able to speak them over that person in a way that points them back to how God is working in and through them. That's how we start to see encouragement take place. Encouragement requires selflessness. It requires active listening, and it requires a willingness to invest in other people's lives. But the more that you do it, the more that you practice encouragement, the more natural it becomes. Developing the practice of encouragement really is like working out a muscle. The more you do it, the stronger and more noticeable it becomes in your life. So this morning, we're actually going to close a little bit differently than usual. We're going to be intentionally preparing our hearts to practice encouragement. This is going to look a little bit different than how we normally close out a teaching, but I think it's important that we leave this morning with some tangible next steps for how we're going to apply the practice of encouragement to our lives. So here in just a second, we're going to throw a few prompts up on the screen. We're going to have someone come up and play keys, and it'll be moody, it'll be sick. But what I'd like you to do, sorry, my youth guy is coming out a little bit. What I'd like you to do is pull out your notebook or pull out a phone, and we're going to have a few different prompts. And I'd love for you to actually write down and answer some of these questions tangibly so that this week you can go out and actually start practicing this type of encouragement. A few questions to help prime us to do this well. The first question I'd love for us to ask is, who in your life needs encouragement? Who in your life needs encouragement? Go ahead and think of that person or those people, write their names down, have it listed out somewhere. Who's been in a difficult season? Who's had plenty of current reasons for discouragement? Who are the people in your life that you know could use some encouragement? Once you have those people in mind, secondly, where do you see God at work and evident in their lives? Postures they've taken or things they've done or said or given time and energy to. Where do you see God at work in their lives? Or where do you see them modeling who the Lord is in the way that they live? And then the third question, what specifically is encouraging to you about that? Not just saying, hey, you did this thing, but hey, here's how you doing this thing was especially helpful to me, others, and the world around you. So I'm going to give you all just a couple of minutes to actually practice this. So use this time, be in your notes, be on your phone writing these things out. We're going to have the keys play for a couple minutes, and then I'll come back up and close this here in just a second. Now that we've done some of the prep work, let me encourage you to actually put this into practice. Maybe right now you want to go and you want to encourage someone and take communion with them if they aren't here. Maybe it's time to put a reminder in your phone to remind you to go follow up with that person this week. But don't leave here today without having a plan for how you're going to intentionally encourage someone. Here in just a moment, we're going to come to the tables and take communion. We're going to take communion as a church family, and as we do that, I'd love for us to remember what the act of taking the bread and the cup means for us. We do this as a reminder that Jesus gave up his life as a sacrifice for our sins. He did it so that we could live in relationship with him. So when we take communion, we're reminded and encouraged by what Jesus has done for us on the cross to defeat sin and death. Communion is Jesus' encouragement to us, a covenant and a promise that he is for us and that he will not forsake us. So as we strive to encourage others, we do it knowing that the greatest encouragement that we could ever receive is the person and the works of Jesus Christ. Let's pray.